the three R's. Can't get away from that. You mentioned the Golden Gate Bridge, which a lot of us are familiar with. There's also a Golden Gate Park. And when we were not deployed overseas. My squadron was back in California. And, I got to go to the very first Earth Day in Golden Gate Park. And the speaker that day was Ralph Nader. And he had written a best-selling book, some of you may recall, called Unsafe at Any Speed. It was written about my car, the Chevrolet Corvair. It was an air-cooled engine in back, and it had a way of going around the curve. You go around a real sharp curve. It would like change directions, and you'd find yourself going the opposite direction. And the other thing we found out is that in the winter, when you turn on the heater, carbon monoxide would come out of the heater. So when I was at Ohio State, I bought it when I was like a senior at Ohio State. And when the young women in the Ohio State found out that my car was a Corvair, it was hard to get dates in the winter. And but I lived to make it to Pensacola, Florida, and sold it for $1. And bought myself a Volkswagen Carmagia, which I think I ended up with like 200,000 miles on it. So, but it started with the Corvair Monza, great memories. And I want to say thank you for your leadership in California, and thank you very much for your leadership here. We have a bunch of all of us serve on a number of committees. I have served on about 3 or 4 others, and some of my colleagues do, and a lot of those committees are meeting right now. And our members are going to kind of try to pop in as to the extent that they can. But until they do, I'm going to proceed to just to ask questions. My next question would be of Dr. Johnson of you. And but several countries, as we may know, including Canada, and I think France is one of them, have established extended producer responsibility laws. And recently, I think we've had some mention here today of Colorado, Maine, California, and Oregon have passed their own laws for consumer packaging. We've heard both pros and cons to these laws. And one concern we've heard from stakeholders is about the challenges we've heard here today, of the challenges of a patchwork state-by-state approach to recycling policies, such as differing labeling requirements. I mentioned the National Governors Association actually has an entity that that is in place for to actually share good ideas with one another, and to find out what works and do more of that. But the question, it's called Center for Best Practices within the NGA, and it's a great organization. It's still very active, and we try to work with them in ways that are helpful to the federal government, to Congress, and also to state and local governments. Dr. Johnson, a follow-up question for you. Would you please share some of your experiences as a global business working with national and international extended producer responsibility laws, and what are some of the challenges that SC Johnson has faced in complying with these laws, and how might the regulatory entities address those challenges?
So I think there's some good models of EPR legislation out there. I would hold British Columbia up as an excellent example. You shared that as an example earlier, Senator, where they've been able to achieve high recovery rates and very high access to recycling for the population in British Columbia. Some of the challenges that we've had, revolve more around transparency of fees. The one thing that I would like to see more of in extended producer responsibility regulation is more of a push on reuse and refill. And that is, probably one of the best approaches to minimizing environmental impact. And I'd just like to share an example, if I could. 12 years ago, we launched a concentrate which you could put in this Windex bottle and fill it with water. So you can reuse this trigger bottle, 100 times if you want it. It's got, that is the best environmental footprint for this kind of product. But it doesn't sell very well. Most consumers, plastic is just not top of mind enough for them to want to go through the inconvenience of putting a concentrate in here and refilling this bottle. And it just comes back to it's very hard for an individual company to make progress with these kinds of innovations. But if we have things in the regulation that could help incentivize these kinds of things and bring scale at retail, if retailers had 30% of their space devoted to refill, reuse options, if, many companies created those options for their brand, if we had education programs, if we had subsidies, that could help this kind of innovation. France has put in their regulation a minimum amount of retail space that you've got to devote to these options. The United Kingdom is giving subsidies for refill stations in Europe. We have over 700 refill stations for a laundry detergent brand in Europe. And those kinds of things work, and I would love to see that kind of added to a regulation that we could have federally here in the United States.
Okay, thank you for that. Ms. Simon, and again, probably Dr. Johnson, but we'll start off with you. Ms. Simon, as I mentioned, I think in my opening statement, some materials have more viable markets for repurchasing than others, as you know. It's known as end markets. I believe that's what they call end markets. So, for example, paper is recycled at almost 70%. And recycled paper is often put back into products for resale. But plastic products do not have the same recovery rate or value as a recycled product. A question, I think for you and maybe for Dr. Johnson as well. How can extended producer responsibility policies establish new end markets for recycled materials? Ms. Simon.
Well, every single one of the materials that we depend on for single use today, whether it's paper, aluminum, glass, or plastic, comes from a resource and comes with impact, right? So we should be making our best effort to make sure all of those materials are getting recycled. And they all end up in the same blue bin. So when we're talking about an extended producer responsibility scheme at the federal level, we need to be considering all of those materials at once and how we can create design standards and eco-modulation to enhance and improve the way those materials are designed for recycling and for the infrastructure and technologies needed to most efficiently recycle them, so that we have high-value materials on the back end for all of that, right? So maybe the improvement from paper up is, not as high as it would be because we have a much lower starting point for other materials, but that improvement is still needed because paper and paperboard are the materials within that blue bin that absorb the most of the contaminants, right? And because they are on the lower end of the amount of times you can recycle them, those contaminants actually have a bigger impact on the strength of those fibers when they're being recycled. So I think there is mutual benefit that can happen across all materials for those secondary markets.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson?
I would just say that a key tenet of extended producer responsibility regulation and a key responsibility of the producer organization is to help create those end-of-life markets. If you look at the British Columbia example, today over 99% of what they collect goes into an end market. And that's been improved over time. And again, I think eco-modulation is an important tenet as well. You create a plastic pollution hierarchy, and you create an incentive system to move products from going into landfill or waste to energy up to higher value, more circular markets. And to me, that's a very helpful and important principle in extended producer responsibility regulation.
But let me just follow up with that. How important are viable end markets for a company like yours that's trying to use more recycled content in your packaging materials?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
How important are viable end markets for a company like yours that's trying to use more recycled content in packaging materials?
It's extremely important, and it, you know, what regulation does is it creates scale. It creates scale and supply of post-consumer recycled plastic, which is important to us because we're meeting our own internal goals of using recycled plastic. It's important for us to see that even today, some of the hard-to-recycle things get into even downcycled markets. So it's, to me, it's a critical part of regulation.
Good, thank you. I think that's my questions. I think those are my questions. I want to mention a couple of things if I can. Senator Capito, Senator Bozeman, and I have provided leadership in introducing two significant pieces of legislation to deal with recycling. We've talked about it many times in this room. Some of you are familiar with them. They passed out of committee, I think unanimously. We have very broad support within the Senate, and in an effort to try to reconcile our legislation with what's going on in the House. We've stumbled over something. It's called in the Senate. It's called a hold, H-O-L-D, and a member of the Senate, Democrat or Republican, put a hold in some cases on legislation that he or she has concerns about. One of our colleagues, Senator Lee of Utah, has lifted his hold. He has lifted his hold. We learned this morning on the two recycling bills that this committee has moved earlier in this Congress that we talked about here even today with Senator Capito has provided a lot of leadership on that along with Senator Bozeman and our staff's great staff work on that, and we appreciate very much the decision by Senator Lee to lift his hold. We're going to be, Senator Capito and I are going to be working, and our staff's going to be working with, we call it with the floor. I don't know how you work with the floor in the Senate, but the folks who work the floor for the Democratic and Republican leadership, see if we can't move these two recycling bills as soon as possible so we can work with the House to get them to President Biden's desk. So it's a piece of good news. We don't always have good news, but that's good news, and we're real happy and grateful to Senator Lee for what he has done. Before we wrap it up, one of the things I like to do, well, I'm always looking for consensus. How do we build consensus? How do we build consensus here across political lines? How do we build consensus between the House and the Senate? How do we build consensus with states and governors and other levels of government? I'm going to ask you in closing, if you would, just to maybe close with each of you with like a thought or two in terms of actually taking us closer to consensus on something, an issue of significance relating to recycling. It could be what we're talking about today. It could be something else that's related to what we're talking about today. But what, and just a fact, maybe we're not asking a question that triggered a response. What else do you think you want to kind of leave us? You had a chance to give an opening statement. I want you to give just a short closing statement with some real wisdom, and you've already given us a lot of that already. I'm going to ask Mr. Felton if he would just lead us off, and then we'll wrap it up with Ms. Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Three quick thoughts. One is consensus is critical, and we need people at the table. And I'm not suggesting the people here in the room today are not at the table, but one thing Ameripan has discovered over the last 4 years is we're only going to solve these problems if all stakeholders sit down together, and that is what consensus is. So encourage those who are not currently engaged in this issue to follow hearings like this, understand the complexities of it, and move forward with us. Two other things I want to say. I do want to mention that while we have, I believe 40 countries around the world that have EPR in place, many of those programs were set up 20 and 30 years ago for a different set of packaging, a different set of technology. These programs are continuing to evolve. So as we point point towards other countries and what they're doing right. I think we need to be mindful of that, and we need to be mindful that I think we need a unique United States solution as well for the way that things are set up here in the United States. My last comment is data, data, data. We need data.
You say data?
Data, yeah, I did 3 times. We need that desperately. And I think there's a role for the federal government to help with that. So as we're looking to find consensus, looking to drive industry interests and environmental interests and state interests, is we lack data that is desperately needed, and we need to work more on that.
Good. I think one of the pieces of legislation that, one of the 2 pieces I talked about,
It does.
speaks to that issue, and which is good. So
Yeah.
we've been responsive. Thank you for the encouragement, Dr. Johnson.
I would just say, obviously, consensus is important. Far be it from me to suggest what might help build that. I would just say that, given the emerging state regulations, that federal regulation will help prevent overregulation. And I think that should be important for everybody. I would also say that this is an important emerging issue. I know you talked about microplastic last week. That, I think, is becoming a very important human health issue that needs to be solved. And I think if there's anything with urgency around it, it's that. But I appreciate the opportunity today to share my views. So thank
We're
you.
delighted you could join us again. Thank you for sharing your views with us. Ms. Simon.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the opportunity once again. When you talk about consensus, it makes me think about the process that's happening in parallel to this in the United Nations around the treaty, where it is the goal, right, for all of those member states to come together and find a common path forward against a shared threat. And that is really hard to do in quite a divisive world, as it can be to find paths forward in the U.S., but an interesting thing has emerged in these negotiations and in the momentum in the U.S. is that where we have common ground from more players than ever before is on extended producer responsibility. We may have different reasons for why we want it, but ultimately we all need better, more harmonized standards. We need better collection, we need better processing, and we need better secondary materials. So that is fairly common, and I think why you see more excitement and activity from the private sector on this. They want that more than anything. I want to add one thing. I didn't get a chance to comment on the cost thing earlier, and I was hoping I could just add a
on the
few
what?
thoughts. Pardon?
You didn't get
On the cost to
Okay.
the consumer. I think the cost is already on the consumer in the form of plastic waste today, and municipalities that are currently dealing with that. So I think we need to make sure we're considering where these costs are falling as we do the full balance sheet for what an EPR system would do. Mayors in the Midwest, part of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, talk about cost as one of the challenges they faced in how it's coming down to the local taxpayers. Those mayors will be on the Hill tomorrow to talk about their support of EPR also. And Washington has done some studies that have shown that there are benefits to it coming back in the form of $600 to $300 a year by not having to pay for trash services. So I think there's an opportunity to find that common ground and where there can be those benefits to businesses, those benefits to the government, and those benefits to the communities who really need it. So thank you again for the opportunity. And appreciate it.
We thank you all. I hope your work provides you as much joy and satisfaction as our work provides for us. People who follow the news and follow what goes in Washington think that we don't like each other and can't stand working with one another. And that could not be further from the truth, at least with respect to many of the issues before this committee. We have a lot of mutual respect. We have a great, I think, great track record in things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which we were involved in helping to write, and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has huge climate provisions in it, some of which we talked a little bit about here too today. But Winston, not Winston, I was going to say Winston Churchill, but another great leader was it's a statue of him a couple of miles from where we're gathered here today, and it's our former president, Abraham Lincoln. And one of my favorite Lincoln quotes is, in response to the question, what is the role of government? What is the role of government? Lincoln used to say the role of government is to do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. The role of government is to do for the people what we cannot do for themselves. There's a lot of wisdom in that. And one of the ways that the government works best is when we do it in a collaborative way and look for common ground, trying to find ways to harness market forces where that works, and realize that there's a moral imperative for this. This is the only planet we're going to have. There's no planet B, and we've got to take care of this planet if we care about our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And I know if we're lucky enough to have those, that we want to make sure they have a wonderful place to inherit and to raise their own families someday. But we appreciate your thoughtful insights into what can be a complex topic. And we look forward to remaining in touch with you if we can find you in a good way. And we want to stay in touch with you and with our committee so that we can really reach some of the best most thoughtful policies and advance these and other shared goals. I want to say a special thanks to Senator Capito, to her staff, to our majority staff, and to the staff of all of our colleagues who participate in helping to select you to be our witnesses and provided some of the questions that have been asked here today. I get to do a little bit of housekeeping here to close out our hearing, and I want to ask. This is my favorite part of the hearing. I want to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a variety of materials that include letters from stakeholders and other materials that relate to today's hearing. And when I ask unanimous consent, and there's no other senator to object, then I can pretty much run the show. So without objection, there you go. Senators are going to be allowed to submit questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday. That's March 20th, and we'll compile those questions. We'll send them to our witnesses, and we'll ask all of you to respond, if you could, by Wednesday, April the 3rd. And in a place where sometimes we don't have great news every day, the news about our friend Senator Lee lifting his hold on our recycling bills is a wonderful piece of news, and I think folks who might have been tuned in across the country are probably encouraged by your testimony and what you presented to us today and the questions that our members asked. While you've been testifying here for the last almost hour and a half, we've just had a really impressive group of young people coming into the hearing, and there's the seats for folks who might be watching us on C-SPAN or television. We have a number of people can sit in the hearing room. We have seats for maybe 50, 60, 70 people, and but we've had probably 100 or more young people. They look like they're in maybe high school or maybe college that are coming. They could have gone to any hearing. We have a lot of committees. They could have gone to any hearing. They could have gone to see the House in order or in session or the Senate over in the Capitol. They came here. They came here by the dozens. And they came here because they know this is important. And this is important for them in their lives and the families that they'll raise someday. We don't want to let them down. We don't want to let them down. And I'm proud to say that I think on this committee we're not letting them down. And with your help, we'll continue to do that. And with that, this hearing is a wrap. Thank you all very much. We're adjourned.